This is Fergus Bordewich. I'm the author of Klan War, a history of Ulysses S. Grant's war against the Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s.
Thank you for joining us. And I begin all the interviews with the same question. What brought you to this book's topic, and what did you find most surprising or something you learned in researching it?
Okay, well, I have to answer that in two different ways. What brought me to it, a couple of things. There is a personal dimension, which is to say, I did civil rights work, voter registration in the South in the 1960s, and I dealt with the Klan of that period, which I want to emphasize is another iteration of the Klan than the one my book is about. As I say, I dealt with the Klan personally, up close and very unpleasantly in the 1960s. And it was a subject that moved me a great deal. And I looked for an opportunity to address. But I'm an historian, and I'm a writer of the 19th century. On another plane, this book folds out of several previous books of mine. I've written a string of books about American politics, often dealing with the history of slavery, abolitionism, Civil War, beginning in the 1790s up to the Reconstruction here. And this book folded out of my last book, which was a history of how the then very progressive Republican Party fought the Civil War. The radicals in Congress fought the Civil War. And these were the same individuals. They were all men because there were no women in politics in those days. How the radicals in Congress pushed the presidency to deal with Klan terror. So there was a natural evolution there. And finally, this book is deeply about an issue that has concerned me for many years, which has to do with the thin line in any society, including our own, between civilization and barbarism. You know, that this book is about American terrorism. This is the first organized terrorist movement in American history. There's no sugarcoating of it. It was a terrorist movement. Its reason for existence was terror, to wreak terror on people. And, we are accustomed to thinking of terrorism as something that happens far away, really, as in terms of movements anyway. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, others. But this is American, homegrown and American. It's not a movement of louts and thugs and losers in the 1860s and 70s. It's led by the decent citizens of the states where the Klan operated. They were people who operated under the cover of respectability when they had their robes off, and it's important to me to show how close we as a people were and could conceivably be again to barbaric actions in the name of politics.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point that really comes out in the book, because you really make a very strong case for the Klan as being not only terroristic, but also a counter-revolution and the purpose of it is very distinct and targeted. So I'm thinking about the subverting the Reconstruction, keeping blacks and whites from voting, and it was very calculated. So when you say terrorism, there were goals and purposes that they were trying to achieve. Could you speak a little bit on that?
Sure. The Klan had two goals. They were very clear. They were explicit. When people joined the Klan in most places, they had to swear to these goals. This wasn't obscure. This isn't kind of a revisionism, an act of revisionism coming from the present day. This is documented because this is what the Klan wanted. Two goals. One of them was to reduce very recently emancipated African Americans to a state as close to slavery as possible to scare them out of public life, to scare them away from asserting themselves. The second goal, and it was no less a goal, was to destroy the embryonic two-party system in the South. There had been no Republican Party before the Civil War, or during the Civil War for that matter. The Republican Party was embryonic. It was, as I said a few minutes ago, it was forward-looking. It was a party that staked its future on racial integration. It wasn't to say there was no racism, there was plenty. But nonetheless, as a party, it based itself on political alliance and integration between whites and blacks, not social integration. That was a bridge too far, even for most Republicans. And the Republican Party expanded exponentially in the South in the 1860s. African Americans who lost cause mythologizers and defenders say, oh, well, they were all ignorant and illiterate, and what did they know? Well, it turns out that African Americans raced to school as soon as there were schools available, and people of all ages, men and women, and raced to participate in politics, not because they were pushed into it or dragged into it by so-called carpetbaggers, which is a term meant to insult Northerners. But rather through their own agency, a determination to participate. African Americans in the South, huge numbers of them really understood what the game of politics was and wanted to be part of it. The Klan was out to destroy that.
Yeah, and they came dangerously close, as your book describes. And had Johnson maybe gotten another term, it would have come to pass. One of the most fascinating things I found in your book is this tour that Ulysses Grant makes under Johnson, and this other character, Shores, is that how you say his name?
Yeah.
If you could talk a little bit about those two competing narratives. They both saw the same Reconstruction South, but a little bit differently.
Sure. Okay, we all know who Ulysses S. Grant was. He was the commander of U.S. armies at the end of the Civil War, defeated Robert E. Lee, and ended the war militarily. In the years immediately after the war, he remains commander of the armies. Okay, even though the army is rapidly shrinking in size, it's a very important job. Roughly equivalent to today's Joint Chiefs, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, roughly. Carl Schurz used to be extremely well known, even when I was in school, back in junior high school, getting American history. We learned about Carl Schurz. He's now almost completely unknown. Short version is, here he was a remarkable individual, a political refugee from Germany, very well educated, multilingual, had many talents. He used to play the piano for Lincoln in the White House to soothe Lincoln's anxieties. Very well connected, a journalist in English, writer, and he rapidly became really the paramount leader of the German immigrant minority, very large and significant politically in that time. And he will eventually become a U.S. senator, a very significant one, and he figures prominently in my book because I pose him against Grant. Grant has one kind of evolution, embracing a more and more radical position on behalf of African Americans and civil rights. Well, Schurz, a Democrat in his, a democratic individual in his thinking, increasingly shrinks away from that commitment. Okay. But in 1865, Carl Schurz is the radical. Grant is a professional soldier. He's not a conservative, but he's a professional soldier, apolitical, pretty much. Anyway, so year 1865, both of them travel in the very early days of Reconstruction in the South. Grant, who is wined and dined, is very official, and Grant, frankly, is pretty naive. at this point. He listens to important, respectable, influential people who tell him everywhere he goes, oh, things are going to be fine. Relations between the races are fine. They've always been fine. No real problems here. And we Southerners, we defeated Southerners, all are eager to reintegrate into the Union. And Grant comes back, and he was only there it was a very short trip, 3 weeks. I mean, very short. Comes back and reports to President Johnson, everything is copacetic. He's dead wrong. They gave him a snow job. Carl Schurz, then a journalist, not in the Senate yet. He's a journalist. He goes down pretty much under his own steam, travels around very widely all over the South, and talks to all kinds of people. He talks to people on the street. He talks to people on steamboats. He talks to Black people, which Grant did not. He talks to Black people. He talks to all kinds. He talks to unreconstructed Confederates and so on. He comes back and he writes copiously about this, and he describes a hellscape, which is accurate, vulnerable, newly emancipated Black people are being killed with impunity. There were riots, massacres of freed people. The Confederates, he meets many Confederates who want no part of Reconstruction. They're dead. They're ready to go to war again, and so on. Grant, to his credit, and this has to be said, it's important for Grant's evolution. Grant reads what Schurz has written, and Grant apologizes for being so naive and, frankly, stupid. It's part of the crux of his character that he's a man who's able to see more deeply than many others, and he's a guy of really deep feeling, and he is kind of ashamed of himself, frankly, for missing the real story.
Yeah, and I think that we'll talk more about Grant's evolution as we get to what he did about the Klan. But I'd like to kind of explore this idea that the Klan creates for itself, which is this plausible deniability, which is, and you touched on it earlier, that it is mainly just a respectable group of well-to-do people who might get together and have, some conversations. But if there's any violence, it's done by poor whites, maybe Blacks in costumes. There's this. And how does that work? And why do they get away with it for so long? Because as you said, it's a hellscape.
Yeah. There are a couple of things that are playing into this. One of which you've already pointed out, is that the Klan is led by respectable people, local elites, for the most part. They are wealthy people. They're often business owners. They're wealthy property owners, plantation owners, former slave owners who think that they're still slave owners, doctors, lawyers, journalists, sometimes even ministers, people of that type. And sure, they mobilize a lot of people. They attract many people who are more, you would say, working class or white farmers and so on. But bear in mind at the same time, there are a lot of poorer whites who are joining the Republican Party because they've been oppressed by these elites in previous years, and they know it. Okay, so it's not as if all the so-called rednecks are rushing to the Klan. They're kind of up for grabs, frankly. Okay, so on one hand, these are the local elites everywhere. Now, why wasn't Klan terror brought under control right from the start? It would seem like an obvious question. Well, one is that the local authorities everywhere in the former Confederate states were still packed with the people who'd been there during the Confederate years. constables, county sheriffs, town sheriffs, town boards, mayors, justices of the peace, members of state legislatures often are either themselves not infrequently members of the Klan, or they are allies of the Klan, or at least tolerant of it. They may not like its methods, but they share its goals. Okay, so there's this kind of large cocoon of protection around Klansmen. So why can't the federal government do something about this? Wasn't the South under occupation, military occupation? That's what most Americans are kind of conditioned to imagine. Well, okay, you have to look at the numbers. It's true enough that when the war ended in July of 1865, there were about 1 million federal troops under arms all over the South and border states. The pressure to send everybody home. Everybody wants to go home. The soldiers want to go home. Their families want them home. The federal government is deeply in debt because of the war, doesn't want to pay soldiers' salaries anymore. And the number precipitously plummets. By 1868, peak year for the Klan, there are no more than 12,000, 1 million to 12,000 federal troops all over the South, 11 states. And a third of those are on the Texas frontier facing Indians, Native Americans. So the troops are so thinly spread. Somebody I quote in the book, a unionist in the South whose community is being terrorized, says they might as well be in Maine. They can't get here. And significantly, this might seem like a trivial detail, but most of those troops are infantry. And if you think about it, it's pretty hard for guys on foot to catch guys on horses. The Klan operates on horseback, raiding in the night, striking, where it's not expected, mostly. So the army is too thin, not properly distributed, and so on and so on. So and you have sitting in the presidency Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's biggest mistake as president. I mean, it's really, really, it's hard to think of a worse mistake that a president could have made than Lincoln made in picking Johnson for his ticket in 1864. Johnson's previous vice president, forgotten by everybody today, Hannibal Hamlin, who was a very, very staunch, radical Republican abolitionist from the state of Maine, would have been a perfectly decent president. Not charismatic, but charisma didn't matter. Neither was Lincoln, by the way, in his own day. He's charismatic now, he wasn't then. So for ticket balancing reasons, Lincoln accepted Johnson, who was from Tennessee. He had been a slave owner. He emancipated those slaves only after the war had started. And he was a Democrat. He wasn't a Republican. He was never a Republican. He had much more in common with the resurgent Democrats in the South than he had with Republicans in the North. And he acted that way. He did not support the Klan. He was opposed to terrorism, but he was prepared to do nothing to actually crack down on the Klan. So final point here in answer to your question is that all these respectable people, including Johnson, minimized Klan atrocities. They either pretended they weren't happening. Just no. It's like the Russians talking about what they're doing in Ukraine today. Pretended it wasn't happening. Very similar. And so there were virtually no prosecutions of the Klan that enabled the Klan to just grow exponentially once it was founded in 1866.
Yeah, and those are all fantastic points. And I want to skip ahead now to Grant's presidency, because very quickly into his first term, he realizes what he's up against in the South, and that there's this potential for a full-on war to start again. And he does a couple things, and I'm thinking mainly about Attorney General Ackerman. So if you could talk about Amos Ackerman and what he does in the South that really busts apart the Klan on the ground.
Yeah, Amos Ackerman is another one of those people we all ought to know about, but don't. Okay. He was, when you see his image, which is in my book, it looks like a rather meek fellow, kind of bald, and you imagine, I don't know whether he was tall or short, but he seems like a rather, as I said, meek individual. He wasn't. He was from New Hampshire originally, but studied law in the South, in Georgia, made his life there, actually owned slaves for a time, and very reluctantly served in a kind of quartermaster capacity during the war for the Confederacy. He wasn't happy about it. He was a Unionist, not a Confederate. But after the war, he immediately joined the Republican Party, and he became an activist in the Republican Party and embraced emancipation and so on, and became very ardent, an ardent supporter of the Republican Party and furthering the needs of the freed people in the South. Deeply committed to it. He was also quite religious, which was a part of his moral commitment. And he, more than a great many others, really saw deep and felt the deep immorality of slavery and the immorality of the way in which African Americans have been degraded in the South. And he hated the resurgent Democratic effort to return to something like slavery in the South. So really a committed guy. He's picked by Grant as an attorney general. And he, well, I have to give you context here. There's already an effort underway in Congress to pass legislation that will break the Klan. My book goes back and forth between events on the ground in the South and events here on Capitol Hill. I say here, I'm in Washington, D.C., and Capitol Hill is out my window. So there's a very assertive effort on Capitol Hill among radical Republicans to pass legislation, and they do. It's a hard political fight over a couple of years. Several measures are passed. They get stronger and stronger. There are other things going on that have to do with enforcement in the South, the challenges of enforcement. But with Ackerman in place, anchoring the Justice Department in the North, the Justice Department was essentially created for this. There had been an attorney general before, but he was essentially the lawyer for the president. The Justice Department was created in part to mobilize legally against the Klan. Okay, not entirely, but significantly. And Grant taps Ackerman to carry out the legal prong of his war against the Klan. That's one side of it. And I imagine you might want to talk about the other side of it.
Yeah, and now that you mentioned it, the Benjamin Butler side of the legislation and the Enforcement Act, which comes to be known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. So, right, so he's poised to go down and start prosecuting the Klan based on this law, which is, well, you can explain what the Enforcement Act, the fourth, or is it the fourth or the third? The fourth, yeah, go ahead.
Well, let's focus just on the climactic act of these several, which became known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. It had a different, everybody called it that. It was called an Enforcement Act, and it specified precisely what was illegal. These were, I mean, it was tailored specifically to identify the Ku Klux Klan's actions. Bear in mind, the president couldn't act without the color of law. Grant was no tyrant. He wasn't a military ruler. He was the president, and he wanted law. He went personally to Capitol Hill, which was a very big deal. Personally to Capitol Hill to demand this law. It's quite extraordinary, and it says a lot about Grant that he did that, and it required him putting his own word and charisma on the line. He did have charisma as a war hero on the line to sway enough votes to pass it. Okay, but the law, in short, it authorized the president to use troops, federal troops, to protect the rights guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Okay, the 14th Amendment, bear in mind, was a radical amendment by giving the federal government, allowing the federal government to extend citizenship to African Americans and guarantee citizenship for all people. Now, guarantee requires enforcement. This was to enforce those rights. Previously, let's say what we cherish as the key rights in the Bill of Rights were not applied within states. They only applied to the federal government's actions. The 14th Amendment enabled the federal government to act on them in the states. In other words, to break the back of the old states' rights ideology. Very radical. And, we're still wrestling with these issues as we speak today, and read today's newspapers in certain states. But at any rate, so the Ku Klux Klan Act empowered the president to protect the rights guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, to use troops if necessary. Anyone found on a public road in any disguise with intent to cause injury, I'm quoting here, with intent to cause injury or to, quote, terrify, frighten, or overawe, could be charged with a felony under federal law. It declared as federal crimes crossing state lines with the intent to terrorize, as many Klansmen did. They'd go to the neighboring state, and guys from that state would come back to the first state to commit their terrorist act. It declared it a federal crime to join any secret organization that committed a person to swear to commit or conceal an act of terror, or attempting to rescue somebody jailed for such a crime. Klansmen are raiding jail. When Klansmen do get arrested, as they do sometimes, Klansmen break them out. That's now a federal crime. And the local cops don't prosecute, because they may even be in the Klan. They may have handed the keys over to the Klansmen, which happened, by the way. The punishments were very severe, up to $10,000, a huge sum, huge in the 1870s, and up to 20 years in prison, and theoretically execution for the worst crimes. Nobody was actually executed. The law also included a measure which was pivotal here, which was granting the president the authority to suspend habeas corpus, where he believed the public safety required it. In other words, to arrest people, put them in jail. And what this in effect meant was for the military to do it. And they could be tried by military tribunals. Of course, Southerners screamed. They said, this is military rule, this dictatorship, and so on. I mean, they weren't interested in the Klan being reined in. So anyway, that's the gist of what the Ku Klux Klan Act does. And Grant is prepared to use it. He's decisive. He was decisive as a general, and he's decisive now as a president. It's taken him a few years to basically become a politician, not a natural politician at all. But and he's ready to act, and he will use the army.
And it was incredibly successful at first. The amount of people who turned themselves in or who were arrested for membership alone, right, was in the thousands. But what happens to those cases, and where does this story end as far as the Enforcement Act goes?
Let me give you some numbers. Uh, how many people were in the Klan at this juncture? Nobody knows. There's no master list of membership. Doesn't exist. The Klan leader in Tennessee claimed maybe 50,000 members in Tennessee, which is where it originated. Maybe that's quite possible, because the numbers where we do have numbers based on those who turned state's evidence and were arrested, is that there were thousands in virtually every southern state, thousands. So I think the total number was a couple of 100,000. Very large numbers, majority of white male adults in some areas. Okay, the majority, 60, 70%, and so on. So the focus of the military war against the Klan is going to be in upstate South Carolina. Why there? Because it's a hotbed of Klan activity. The Klan owns upcountry South Carolina. It is essentially warfare taking place up there. The authorities, the Unionist authorities, have been overwhelmed. And he intends to make an example of South Carolina. But what's happening in South Carolina is also happening in other states. It's not only there. But in the book, I wrote mostly about South Carolina because it's the template. In 9 counties of South Carolina, 5,000 Klansmen are arrested. That doesn't mean that was every last one, but that's a lot of people. 5,000. The Klan broke. Troops were sent down. I hadn't mentioned that. Very tough troops, by the way, interestingly, as a sidelight. They were primarily, the spearhead was the troopers of the 7th Cavalry. And for those of you who, listeners who may be interested in Western history, that was George Armstrong Custer's regiment, which would be decimated at the Battle of the Little Bighorn just a couple of years later. Custer was not part of this operation. He was a very, very conservative Democrat. He wanted no part of sustaining Reconstruction. It's led by others. Anyway, so the army is there on the ground in South Carolina and elsewhere. They break the Klan. They penetrate the Klan. They're quite prepared to fight. And the Klan, they performed like brave fellows when they were shooting, lynching, stabbing unarmed men, women, and children. Yes, women and children. And the atrocities perpetrated against men, women, and children are appalling. They're appalling. But faced with the carbines of the 7th Cavalry, they began to cave. And then their surrenders cascaded. And even Frederick Douglass, the best known, most famous African-American public figure in the United States, great orator, journalist, writer, even in 1863 declared that the Klan had been broken and African Americans were again free in the South. Now, as you've already implied correctly, it's not quite as simple as all that, but nonetheless, by 1873, the Klan was as a terrorist organization, it was broken.
Yeah, but unfortunately, there weren't many repercussions or prison sentences. There weren't these extravagant fines on most of them, on most of the people who were arrested. And I guess what happened that determined this kind of, and for one thing, you say in the book, they were incredibly overwhelmed. The Justice Department, as it was at the time, couldn't handle all these cases. But there were a couple other things that started to happen that kind of undermined this procedure. And then I want to end with the report that was created after the fact.
Yeah. So why couldn't the Justice Department handle this? Okay, why? Uh, Now, bear in mind, I gave you one figure, 5,000 were arrested just in South Carolina, and there are thousands more else if you wrap them all together, because Congress would not pay for enough prosecutors and judges to prosecute and try Klansmen. It cost a fortune to prosecute those that were. I mean, really an astonishing amount of money. It took a lot of time. And why wouldn't Congress appropriate the money? I mean, money doesn't come from nowhere. Okay, it has to come from Congress. Okay, and didn't I just say a little while ago that congressional radicals supported and enacted these powerful pieces of legislation? Well, why wouldn't they spend the money? Because I'm going to answer this with two things. One, support for Reconstruction was very fast dissipating in the North. Okay, the Northern public was sick of Reconstruction. They were sick of the South's problems. Frankly, they were sick of hearing about Black people's problems. Is there a racist element to this? Yes, there is. Okay, and this is in the North. We're talking about radicals are losing office. Even by 1872, they're losing office. Some of the leading radicals, some have died. They were older men. Others are defeated in primaries, or they're defeated by Democrats. So political support is ebbing. And crucially, in 1874, Democrats regained control of the House of Representatives. Okay. And the Democrats, the Northern Democrats allied with resurgent Southern Democrats, want no part of supporting Reconstruction. They want the army out of the South completely. They will not even remotely contemplate paying the bills for court cases against Klansmen. It's political. It's political. The Klan War was very much won on the ground in the South, and it was politically undermined, subverted, you could say even betrayed, in Washington by resurgent Democrats, because money bills originate in the House of Representatives, not in the Senate, which is still controlled by Republicans. Grant is still in office, but it's not as if he has a pocketbook where he can just pull out millions of dollars to try these cases against the will of Congress. It doesn't. The system doesn't work that way, and this is an example of how democracy, which we all treasure and rightly so, democracy produces consequences that we may not like. I mean, there's a tragic element to this. You know, Reconstruction was an ambitious, even heroic undertaking. When you see it through the lens, not just of our present day values, but through the eyes of the most forward-looking Americans and political people of the 1860s and 70s. It was an attempt to create a freer, more democratic, small d democratic, more equitable and racially balanced South. You know, this is nothing to be ashamed of. Those of us who might have gotten a certain negative line about Reconstruction in our early schooling should just throw that out the window. I mean, that's an inheritance of the lost cause ideology, which became a national ideology during the Jim Crow era. Well, that's goes to the dustbin of history.
Thankfully, the dustbin of history did not sweep up the crimes and atrocities of the Klan. They were documented very thoroughly in this Klan report that had an enormous print run for a government document, and really did kind of mark the nail in the coffin as to like bringing the light of day onto this terrorist organization. So if you would kind of wrap us up with that report and what it said and kind of its impact.
Okay. Yeah, this was the federal investigation into the Ku Klux Klan, which was a fascinating undertaking, extremely important, as you've indicated. And Congress moved with incredible speed to carry this out. And this is before Democrats regained control of the House of Representatives. Republicans controlled both houses in 1871. They set up a committee to investigate the Klan. They sent subcommittees to undertake hearings all over the former Confederate states and in Washington. The subcommittees are composed of both Republicans and Democrats. It wasn't a hatchet job. Democrats, let's just say apologists for the Klan, got to call their own witnesses, and they did, including Klansmen, by the way. The report they produced was 13 volumes, 6,000 pages. It is absolutely fascinating. It is everything you would want to know about the Klan in real time. Witness testimony. You want to know what people who were victims of the Klan, perpetrators even, were saying at the time, what they were thinking at the time. It's all there. And this is downloadable. It can be accessed online. It's 6,000 pages, my friends, and the print is mighty small. You see, it's physically a bit challenging to read it through, but it's terrific. And remarkably, I want to say this because it's something that even by those who know this report don't always acknowledge. It was the first congressional investigation that took testimony from African Americans. Lots of African Americans, men and women. It is also the first congressional investigation to take testimony from women, Black women, white women. So it's historic in that sense also. And you're hearing people, especially African Americans, but not only, who are talking about things that they have undergone, witnessed, what's happened to members of their families, to themselves, atrocities that they've seen or been threatened with, that sometimes will make your skin crawl, frankly. I mean, there's a lot of other stuff in there, but it was an immensely valuable resource from my book, and it's a document, a giant document that really deserves to be much better known. I think it's one of the great historic documents in our history.